I, like many competitive Pokemon Go players, really appreciate PvPoke.com and all the development that goes into that, and all the data that we can get out from PvPoke itself. So under these rankings here, we've not only got the movesets and the matchups and counters, but we've also got this matchup, the total matchups, if you will, the multi-battle functionality. And we can even download that as a CSV. And so I've gone through the top 30 and downloaded top 30 for the Sinister Cup and downloaded all of those. And we're going to see what kind of data we can get out of that. All right, so one of the best results that I've gotten out of this data is these radar charts. And so here we've got the Pokemon that we're interested in looking at, and then all of its matchups put on this, what is known as a radar chart. So this is based on the PvPoke scores. So above 500 is a win, below 500 is a loss, and the closer to 1,000, the better the win, the closer to 0, the worse the loss. And the Pokemon that are listed radially here are in order by typing. And so this little slice here is Ghost, this slice is Fighting, this slice is Psychic, and this slice is Steel. The intersection here being Bronzong, the intersection here being Medicham and Glade. And they're also sort of ordered by secondary typing. So Haunter and Gengar are next to each other, and all of the straight ghost types are here: Banette, Dusclops, Dusknoir, Mismagius. But they don't have a necessarily set order. I try to put the straight typings towards the, I guess this is by the left up here, and of course the right down here. But obviously this breaks down with the psychic types, but then after that I put in straight psychics. But yeah, so what kind of data can we get from these charts now that I've explained what they are? Well, I think we can figure out what each Pokemon matches up versus typings in a pretty intuitive manner this way. So let's go to a pretty simple example. Something that's got pretty strong type dependence. Let's just go with Gardevoir. So here we can see Gardevoir is going to do really well against any fighting type, and pretty well against the Psychics, but it's not going to do very good against Steel, and it's going to do fairly mediocre against Ghost, really only winning against Dusknoir and Mismagius, Frostlass, and Drifblim. And I guess it's winning against Banette. So pretty mediocre there. We've got some big losses like Gengar, or not necessarily Gengar, Haunter, Alola Marowak, and Dusclops. But yeah, that's kind of the information we can get from this. And there's an image that I've put on the Reddit by this point. But I'm also going to be sharing this sheet underneath the video, so you can look at this, and it's going to be read only, but you can make a copy of it and change the data around and do whatever you want with it. All right, so this is a much more raw look at the data, a little less visually appealing, but there's still colors. And so just a basic explanation. Frostlass versus Drifblim. Oh, that's not a great example because that's a tie. Claydol versus Haunter. So Claydol wins against Haunter. So it's column versus row. A bit counterintuitive, but it's really the way that PvPoke data comes out. It's the same scoring as before. Above 500 a win, below 500 a loss, and I've colored them accordingly. Yellow being straight 500, red being a pretty bad loss, and green being a pretty good win. Here we've got a little more useful information, the correlation. So how close do the Pokemon do against a variety of different Pokemon? Put in a better way, if Pokemon A does good against certain Pokemon and bad against other certain Pokemon, and Pokemon B does good against the same Pokemon that Pokemon A did good at and bad against the same Pokemon that Pokemon B did good at, then they're going to be positively correlated. And if it's the opposite, then they're going to be negatively correlated, which you can see a little bit in the very red here, but there's not nearly as high numbers in the red. And so obviously every Pokemon is going to be perfectly correlated with itself, so that's not particularly interesting. But it is a good baseline for, which correlations are the highest. For instance, Primeape and Machamp have a correlation of 0.96, which when out of 1 is pretty good. So you can replace Primeape and Machamp pretty easily, and honestly, there's a lot of fighting correlation. They pretty well fill the same role, with the obvious exceptions of Poliwrath, Gallade, and Medicham. Except that one's a little more correlated. And then, of course, Probopass and Bastiodon are pretty correlated. And so that's one way of looking at it. The other way is saying, well, what is the most correlated Pokemon with Dusclops? It's Alolan Marowak at 0.5. So Dusclops is a pretty unique Pokemon. It fills a pretty generally unique role. And you can categorize the Pokemon based on that and say, well, this Pokemon is the most unique. And so I'll leave that up to you if you want to do that. Again, I'll be sharing this exact same sheet with everyone. And then here, we've got score comparisons. So it's the total score of this one divided by the total score of this one. And so the total score of Haunter is a little less than Alolan Marowak. This is probably best interpreted with the previous chart. So if you're going to replace Bastiodon with Probopass, let me go ahead and hit that line there. There we go. With Probopass, you can see that you actually get a little more out of Probopass. So that's interesting. And I would argue that generally speaking, Probopass is better. And we'll see that in the next set of data that we look at. So this sheet is my team analysis. So these columns here are which Pokemon are on which team. And then this is the average score and the win percentage. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the assumptions in the model that I'm making. Because any model really that you're going to use to model how PvP works with different teams is going to have a large number of assumptions, and some of these assumptions are there to reflect reality of what the player knows, and some of them are to make it computationally inexpensive, which this was pretty expensive still, as it took a whole night to run. But not that bad, in which I'm waiting a month and then I get the results after the cup has ended. So the assumptions that I'm making here are that each Pokemon gets a shield, so I don't have to worry about when to use which shield when. You just get one shield per Pokemon, which isn't exactly reflective of reality, of course, because then you get 3 shields, but it is a simplification we're making for this model. And the other assumption is that you can't switch. So perhaps this is not a win percentage, but more of a win without switching percentage, which I think is just as important, because having to switch already puts you in a less than ideal situation in terms of a matchup. And then finally, how the score is calculated. You get the first score of the lead matchup, and then if the lead matchup is above 500, then you get the best scores of the matchups possible from the other two, or if you lose, you get the worst, and if you tie, you get the average. So if I win a matchup, if I win the lead matchup, then you have to put a Pokemon in, and then I can choose a Pokemon that counters that, and so I think that's pretty respective of reality as it stands here. And so these are left as their numbers so that I can calculate this over here. But the winning team actually, in terms of win percentage, which you can sort by average score if you want, is Dusclops, Polyrath, Mawile. So while Alola Marowak is ranked number 1, it's actually not in the top team. It's certainly doing very good, and you should probably still have it on your team, given that it's in like almost all of these top teams here. But it's not in the number 1 spot, which is interesting. And so if we look at the histogram of the win percentages here, we can see it's pretty Gaussian in nature, pretty well spread out, which I think really speaks volumes to the Silph team for creating this cup and it being pretty balanced. Even after the new moveset releases, which some people were concerned about, it's still pretty balanced. There's a little bit of a contribution from the tail here, I would say, but it's also in the low region, so it doesn't matter as much. And if you're really interested in that, you can look into the kurtosis, but I think it doesn't matter as much. And the other thing I did with this is I've got the ranking that PvPoke gives a Pokemon, which is based on its individual matchups, and then its team win percentages. So this is actually a cumulative conditional sum that basically says if these columns, if one of them is 1, for instance this one, then add the win percentage to this and then divide it all by 1218, which actually ends up being the number of teams composed of top 30 Pokemon that a singular Pokemon can be in. And then, so we've got the different team percentages here, and here I have graphed them. So does the PvPoke rating correlate with the team rankings? Not so much, as you can see. There's an R-squared of 0.001, and the line is almost perfectly flat. I think there's a slight negative slope there. But Mawile, being ranked 20th, is at the highest, with 46% of the teams that contain Mawile winning. Then we've got Medicham with 34%. And Polyrath with 26%. None of those are even in the top 15. So there's not a lot of correlation there, which is really interesting because you use PvPoke to create your individual teams, but it really matters these matchups and how well they do together as a team. All right, so here we've got the team matchups as a 3D graph here. For the purposes of interactive graphing, I have switched from Google Drive to JuliaBox, and so that I could run actual code instead of just Google Scripts. And so in this form, it's not an incredibly useful chart, I would say. It's a big birthday cake, essentially. The reason it's triangular is, again, because the other data is redundant because in my model, the order of the second and third Pokemon do not matter. But we can look at individual matchups and see how that works out. So each of these different dots here is a lead. So if we just want to look at Alola Marowak as a lead, we can just select that by double-clicking. And then we can see that it's pretty high, pretty centered around 0.8 for the win score here. But we can look at, well, what's a better lead than Alola Marowak? And one of the better ones is Dusclops. So we can add that in, and you can see that for most Pokemon teams, Dusclops beats Alola Marowak. And not necessarily by much on the ones that it loses is it beat by Alola Marowak. So generally, I think the data shows that Dusclops is a better lead. And so that's kind of the one way you can use to look at this kind of data. The other is just saying, how similar are two Pokemon? And Bastiodon and Probopass basically have the same matchups here. Probopass actually ends up being a little better, as it turns out, and we saw that earlier with the score comparison. The other thing is you can select a number of lead Pokemon that you would have from your team. So say my team is Alola Marowak, Haunter, Dusclops, Mawile, Medicham, and what am I missing? Poliwrath. Definitely arbitrarily chosen and not the 6 Pokemon I'm looking at now. So you can see on which matchups you would want which particular Pokemon. It's a little harder to see the axes here, but you can also just generally see, for most of these, the Dusclops is going to be a better lead, but there's some solid Mawile options in here, and Alola Marowak. But generally, all of them are pretty high. You probably don't want to lead with the Hunter. But yeah, so using this 3D chart, I think we can visualize this team data a little bit better and use it to make decisions on how we choose our teams. And so I'm also going to add this notebook to the files that I share underneath the video. So if you're interested, you can check that out as well.